On the evening of December 17, 1944, a column of German Panther and Mark IV tanks from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler rumbled down a narrow, frozen Belgian road toward the town of Stavelot. Snow lay heavy on the surrounding fields. The Ardennes forest pressed in from both sides, dark and utterly silent. The tanks belonged to Kampfgruppe Piper, the armoured spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army, and they had been ordered to seize the bridges over the Meuse River at all costs. Behind this column stretched the full weight of Hitler's last great offensive in the West. 3 German armies, the 6th Panzer, 5th Panzer, and 7th, with over 200,000 combat troops, approximately 1,900 guns and rocket launchers, and hundreds of tanks and assault guns had been secretly assembled for this single blow. The objective was breathtaking in its ambition. Split the Allied armies in two, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Everything depended on speed and momentum. Piper's battle group, consisting of approximately 4,800 men with Panther tanks, Tiger II, King Tiger heavy tanks, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, and self-propelled guns, had to reach the Meuse bridges within 48 hours, or the entire plan would begin to unravel. Time was the one resource Germany could not replace. Ahead of those tanks, at the stone bridge over the Amblev River in Stavelot, stood a force that would have baffled any German staff officer who studied it on paper. It was not an infantry regiment. It was not an armoured battalion. It was not even a full platoon. It was a squad of American engineers. According to the account of their commanding officer, Colonel David Pergrin, there were 13 of them, armed with 1 bazooka, a daisy chain of anti-tank mines, and their M1 Garand rifles. They belonged to 3rd Squad, 2nd Platoon, Company C, of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. They were not infantrymen by training or by designation. Their primary job was to build bridges, clear roads, lay minefields, and blow obstacles. But on that freezing December evening, with no infantry anywhere in sight, and the most feared panzer column in the German army bearing down on their position, those 13 engineers did something that would astonish their enemies and alter the course of the entire battle. They emplaced their mines across the road, took up firing positions beside the bridge, and waited for the tanks to come. They were far from the only engineers who did this during the war. Throughout the Second World War in Europe, German commanders encountered a phenomenon they struggled to explain or understand. American engineer units, the men whose official job it was to build roads, construct bridges, clear minefields, and handle demolitions, kept appearing on the front line fighting as infantry. Not as a desperate last resort when all other options had been exhausted. Not as scattered stragglers pressed into ad hoc service when the line had completely collapsed, but as organized, aggressive, well-armed combat units that held key terrain, destroyed bridges in the teeth of advancing panzer spearheads, and then stood their ground with rifles, machine guns, and bazookas against tanks and grenadiers who expected to find nothing but empty roads behind the demolished crossings. To the Germans, this was deeply confusing. In their army, engineers were specialists. Highly trained, highly respected, indispensable, but specialists all the same. If German pionniers were found fighting as line infantry, it meant the situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. It was a sign of catastrophe and desperation, of scraping together every available body to plug a crumbling line. Yet in the American army, combat engineers fighting as riflemen was not a sign of collapse. It was written into the field manuals. It was trained, practiced, and fully expected. It was standard operating doctrine, and it would prove to be one of the most important and least understood American advantages of the entire war. To understand why this surprised the Germans so deeply, and why it mattered so profoundly when the great crises of the European campaign arrived, you first need to understand what an American Engineer Combat Battalion actually was. It was not a construction crew in olive drab uniforms. It was a carefully designed hybrid organization, built from the ground up to perform 2 fundamentally different missions: building and fighting. Under the Table of Organization and Equipment published in March of 1944, designated TO and E5-15, a standard U.S. Army Engineer Combat Battalion consisted of a headquarters and service company, plus 3 lettered combat companies, designated A, B, and C. Its authorized strength was 666 men, including 29 officers and 3 warrant officers. That gave it roughly 75 to 80% of the manpower of a standard American infantry battalion, which fielded about 870 men, organized into 3 rifle companies and a heavy weapons company. An Engineer Combat Battalion was not a small unit. It was a substantial fighting formation in its own right. The weapons an Engineer Battalion carried told the story of its dual identity. Each battalion was equipped with 565 M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles, 65 M1 carbines, 16 Thompson or M3 grease gun submachine guns, 18 30 caliber air-cooled machine guns, 12 50 caliber heavy machine guns mounted on vehicles, and 29 2.36-inch bazookas, the primary anti-armor weapon available to the engineer soldier. Those weapons gave the battalion considerable small arms firepower, but what the Engineer Battalion did not carry was equally significant. There were no mortars of any caliber, no towed anti-tank guns beyond the man-portable bazookas, no heavy weapons company with the water-cooled machine guns, 81mm mortars, and 57mm anti-tank guns that gave an infantry battalion its sustained killing power in a prolonged defensive engagement. On paper, an Engineer Combat Battalion looked like an infantry battalion that had been stripped of its heaviest and most effective support weapons. But the engineers possessed something that no infantry unit carried in comparable quantity: explosives. Literal tons of TNT, composition C2 and C3 plastic explosive, prepared demolition charges, satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes for clearing wire and obstacles, and a full basic load of both anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Every man in an Engineer Combat Battalion knew how to prepare and detonate a demolition charge. Every squad could rig a bridge for destruction in a matter of minutes. In a defensive fight, when the objective was to deny terrain to the enemy, destroy critical infrastructure, block roads, crater intersections, and channel an attacking force into predetermined kill zones, those explosives could be more decisive than artillery. An infantry battalion could hold a hill. An engineer battalion could destroy the road leading to it, mine the approaches, blow the bridge behind it, and then hold the wreckage it had created. The sheer scale of American engineer forces in the Second World War was staggering. The United States Army raised approximately 700 engineer battalions of all types during the conflict. That number alone would have astonished any German logistics officer. In the European theatre of operations, there were 62 engineer combat groups, each controlling several battalions. Every American infantry division had its own organic engineer combat battalion, permanently assigned and trained alongside the division's rifle regiments. Every corps and army headquarters controlled additional non-divisional engineer combat battalions organized into groups, available for major construction projects, tactical bridge building, road repair, sawmill operations, and the 1,000 other engineering tasks that kept a modern army moving. But those same non-divisional battalions were also available, whenever the front cracked open, to pick up their rifles and fight as infantry alongside the men they normally supported from behind. This was not improvisation. This was the system working exactly as it was designed to work. The doctrinal foundation was explicit and unambiguous. Field Manual 5-5, titled Engineer Field Manual for Engineer Troops, and Field Manual 21-105, the Engineer Soldier's Handbook published on the 2nd of June, 1943, defined the combat engineer's mission as having 3 distinct components. The first was mobility, meaning bridge construction, road building, mine clearance, and obstacle removal, so that friendly forces could advance. The second was counter-mobility, meaning mine laying, demolition operations, and obstacle construction to slow, channel, and stop the enemy. And the third was combat, meaning fighting as infantry when the tactical situation demanded it. That third component was not an afterthought added as a footnote. It was a core element of the engineer identity, trained from the first weeks of basic instruction and exercised regularly throughout a unit's preparation for deployment. The emphasis on infantry combat skills became especially intense after a painful lesson in North Africa. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February of 1943, American forces suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Entire units were overrun and scattered. Among the lessons drawn from that disaster was the recognition that support units operating anywhere near the combat zone including engineers, would inevitably be drawn into fighting whether they were prepared for it or not. Units that could not defend themselves would be destroyed. The Army's senior leadership drew a firm conclusion. Every man who might hear a shot fired in anger had to be able to fight back effectively. From that point forward, Engineer Combat Battalions received demanding infantry training alongside their engineering instruction. They trained at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, Camp Abbott in Oregon, Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, and Camp Swift in Texas. The training was comprehensive and physically demanding. They learned small unit infantry tactics, weapons qualification on every weapon in the battalion's inventory, fire and movement drills, the construction and defense of field positions, combat patrolling, ambush and counter-ambush techniques, and night operations. By the time they shipped overseas, these men could build a Bailey Bridge in the dark and fight a defensive engagement in daylight with equal confidence. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion illustrates this training philosophy perfectly. Activated on March 29, 1943 at Camp Swift, Texas, by redesignation of the 2nd Battalion of the 52nd Engineer Regiment, the 291st trained extensively in infantry tactics at Fort Lewis, Washington, and then conducted additional combat preparation exercises on the coasts of Wales and England before deploying to France after D-Day. Its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, was a Penn State civil engineering graduate from the class of 1940, commissioned as a second lieutenant through ROTC upon graduation and called to active duty in April of 1941. He was an engineer by education and an infantry leader by necessity, and he trained his men to be both. The German approach to military engineering operated under an entirely different philosophy, and understanding that difference is essential to understanding why American engineers shocked the Wehrmacht. German pioneers were organized and trained primarily as assault sappers. Each German infantry division had an organic pioneer battalion, typically 3 companies plus a bridge column and a light engineer column. Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions had armored Panzer Pioneer battalions mounted in SDKFZ 251 half-tracks. These were elite troops, often among the most respected and capable soldiers in their entire formations. But the Pioneer mission was narrowly and specifically defined. In the attack, Pioneer breached fortifications using concentrated explosive charges and flamethrowers, forced river crossings under enemy fire, and cleared obstacles to open the path for the Grenadier assault. They were shock troops assigned to specific, limited tasks. In defense, they reverted to a construction and preparation role, laying minefields, building bunkers and field fortifications, and preparing demolitions of roads, bridges, and infrastructure ahead of an enemy advance. What German pioneer did not do, under any normal circumstances, was serve as independent infantry formations, holding a sector of the defensive line on a sustained basis. When a pioneer battalion appeared in the German front line fighting as ordinary infantry, every experienced officer who observed it understood what it meant. It meant the Grenadier regiments had been bled white, and headquarters was filling the gaps with anyone who could carry a rifle, railway troops, signals companies, supply personnel, headquarters clerks, and engineers. It was the signature of catastrophic manpower exhaustion, not a planned tactical deployment. There was also a critical difference in the authority given to engineers in each army, a difference that would have enormous consequences on the battlefield. After the premature loss of the Mulheim Bridge over the Rhine in October of 1944, Adolf Hitler personally issued a decree that criminalized the unauthorized destruction of bridges by German military engineers. A pioneer officer who demolished a bridge without explicit written authorization from higher command risked court-martial, imprisonment, and execution. This decree created a paralyzing fear among German engineer officers at the very moments when decisiveness mattered most. Engineers at the point of contact hesitated. They waited for orders that sometimes arrived too late or never came at all. They watched enemy forces approach and seize bridges that should have been destroyed minutes earlier. In the American Army, the opposite culture prevailed completely. Engineer, junior officers, company commanders, platoon leaders, and even sergeants and corporals were given standing authority to destroy bridges based on their own assessment of the tactical situation. If the enemy was approaching and the bridge was in danger of capture, the engineer on the ground made the decision and pushed the detonator. No phone call to division headquarters. No written order. No permission slip. This culture of initiative and trust at the lowest leadership levels would prove devastating to German operational plans time and again. The first large-scale demonstration of American engineers fighting as frontline combat troops in the European theatre came on June 6, 1944, at Omaha Beach. The Special Engineer Task Force, built around the 146th and 299th Engineer Combat Battalions with attached naval combat demolition units, landed at H+3 minutes in the very first wave of the invasion. They reached the beach ahead of most infantry assault companies. Their assigned mission was to blow 16 50-yard gaps through the massive obstacle belt that the Germans had constructed across the tidal flat, a forest of welded steel hedgehogs, reinforced concrete tetrahedrons, and wooden stakes capped with Teller anti-tank mines. All 16 gaps were to be cleared within 30 minutes of H-hour to allow the following waves of infantry and vehicles to reach the shore without being destroyed by the obstacles as the tide rose. What the engineers found was not an engineering problem. It was a killing field. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery from the 352nd Infantry Division swept the entire beach with interlocking fields of fire. The engineers waded ashore through chest-deep water, carrying 60-pound packs of explosives into that storm of steel and lead. Only 5 of the 16 gap-clearing teams managed to reach their assigned obstacle positions. The others were scattered across the wrong beach sectors, pinned flat behind the obstacles they were supposed to destroy, or killed in the surf before they could even reach the sand. Of the 8 planned gaps in the 116th Regimental Combat Team's sector on the western half of Omaha, only 2 were cleared by 700 hours. The 121st Engineer Combat Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ploger, landed on the Dog Green and Dog White beach sectors at 0710 hours, actually arriving ahead of much of the infantry of the 116th Regimental Combat Team that they were supposed to support. Their after-action report documented a catastrophic introduction to combat, approximately 50% casualties and 75% of their equipment lost in the initial landing alone. Captain Holmstrup, the commander of Company C, was killed the moment he stepped off the ramp of his landing craft. The 112th Engineer Combat Battalion, an Ohio National Guard unit, originally organic to the 37th Infantry Division, but attached to the 116th Regimental Combat Team of the 29th Infantry Division for the D-Day assault, lost 37 killed and 45 wounded on that single terrible day. The surviving engineers did not huddle on the beach waiting for infantry to arrive and sort things out. They became the infantry themselves. On sections of Omaha Beach, for several critical hours during the morning, engineers were not supporting the rifle companies. They were the rifle companies. Engineer combat patrols fought their way into the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer to clear German snipers because, as the 5th Corps after action report bluntly noted, there were simply not enough infantrymen available to do it. Brigadier General Norman Cotter, the assistant division commander of the 29th Infantry Division, who moved along the beach, rallying any men he could find, regardless of their unit or branch, pushed engineers forward alongside infantrymen to breach the bluffs. The men who went up those draws included engineers carrying Bangalore torpedoes and demolition charges, who blew gaps in the German wire, and then picked up rifles from fallen soldiers to join the assault on the fortified positions. Above, the 121st Engineer Combat Battalion's survivors fought through German positions in Vierville-sur-Mer as riflemen, before finally returning to their proper engineering mission of breaching the heavily defended D1 draw exit, which they eventually blew open with an 1,100-pound concentrated charge of TNT. Following waves brought additional engineer battalions ashore into the chaos. The 37th, 147th, 149th, and 348th Engineer Combat Battalions all landed on Omaha under fire. The 5th and 6th Engineer Special Brigades managed beach logistics and supply operations while under intermittent shelling and sniper fire throughout D-Day and the days that followed. In total, at least 9 Engineer Combat Battalions, plus the 2 Special Brigades, were committed to Omaha Beach alone. On that day, the distinction between engineer and infantryman ceased to exist. 5 months later, the same pattern repeated itself with brutal intensity in one of the most terrible campaigns of the entire war. The Battle of the Huertgen Forest, fought from September through December of 1944, along the heavily fortified German-Belgian border was a grinding, attritional nightmare that consumed American infantry divisions at a horrifying rate. The forest was a labyrinth of steep, wooded ravines, dense undergrowth, and towering fir trees whose canopy exploded into lethal shrapnel bursts when German artillery shells detonated in the treetops above, showering the men below with razor-sharp wood splinters and steel fragments that conventional foxholes could not protect against. The defenders had fortified the forest with interconnected bunker complexes of the Siegfried Line, extensive minefields that made every path a death trap, pre-registered artillery concentrations that could be called down on any grid square within minutes, and overlapping machine gun positions that turned every trail and firebreak into a killing ground. The forest floor was so thick with fallen branches and undergrowth that tanks could barely maneuver, and the terrain channeled attacking troops into predictable avenues that the Germans had zeroed in with mortars and artillery months in advance. Total American casualties in the Huertgen are commonly estimated between 24,000 and 33,000 men across the divisions that fought there. Some rifle companies were destroyed 2 and 3 times over as replacements were fed in, chewed up, and replaced again. In that terrible forest, divisional engineer combat battalions were not confined to the supporting role of building roads and clearing mines behind the advancing infantry. They were in the line beside the riflemen, and sometimes ahead of them. The 15th Engineer Combat Battalion of the 9th Infantry Division lifted 1,352 mines and neutralized 125 German pillboxes under direct enemy fire during the September and October. Fighting. Engineer rifle squads accompanied infantry assault teams directly onto fortified concrete positions, bringing the demolition charges needed to blow open reinforced bunkers while simultaneously fighting as additional riflemen in the close assault. The 4th Engineer Combat Battalion of the 4th Infantry Division was committed alongside the 22nd Infantry Regiment in November, clearing mines under aimed small arms fire and holding perimeter positions when the 22nd's 3 rifle battalions had been bled so thin they could no longer cover their own flanks. The 12th Engineer Combat Battalion of the 8th Infantry Division committed its entire strength to support the 121st Infantry Regiment's attack across the Weissaway Creek, bridging bomb craters and clearing anti-tank mines, while under direct fire from German positions less than 200 yards away. When Major General Cota's 28th Infantry Division launched its attack on the village of Schmidt, 5th Corps reinforced him with 3 additional engineer combat battalions that fought as infantry on the flanks of the division's battered regiments. But it was in the Ardennes, during the massive German offensive that began on December 16, 1944, that the American combat engineer reached the absolute peak of his significance. The Battle of the Bulge produced the single largest employment of engineers as infantry in the entire history of the United States Army. According to Major Francis Kane's authoritative 1985 monograph for the School of Advanced Military Studies at the Army Command and General Staff College, 22 engineer combat battalions were committed to fight as infantry during the Ardennes campaign. The speed at which these engineer battalions were thrown into the defensive line tells its own story of crisis and response. On the first day, December 16th, 3 divisional and 2 non-divisional engineer combat battalions were committed as infantry. On the second day, 9 additional battalions joined them. By the third and fourth days, 5 more battalions had been pushed into the line to block major German penetrations. The engineers were not a reserve force held back for emergencies. In many sectors, they were the first American troops the Germans encountered, because the engineers had already been forward in the supposedly quiet Ardennes, working on roads and bridges, when the German assault began with a thunderous artillery barrage at 5:30 in the morning. Because they were already in position, already organized, already armed, and already trained to fight, they became the immediate response. The most famous episode of the entire battle belongs to the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin, part of Colonel H. Wallace Anderson's 1111 Engineer Combat Group, the 291st's 620 lightly armed engineers became, for a critical period of 24 to 72 hours, the only organized American combat force standing across Kampfgruppe Piper's path to the Meuse River bridges. At Stavelot on the evening of December 17th, that small squad of Company C engineers emplaced their hasty minefield at the stone bridge and waited. At approximately 1900 hours, 3 German tanks approached. The lead tank threw a track on a mine. Bazooka and rifle fire drove off the other 2. Believing he had encountered a strong infantry position, Paper made the fateful decision to halt his column for the night and wait for daylight. That decision, forced by a handful of engineers with a single bazooka, cost him irreplaceable hours. The next morning, December 18th, at approximately 11:15 hours, the crisis reached its climax at the village of Trois-Ponts. Company C of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion under Captain Sam Schäuber, directed on the ground by the battalion's executive officer Major Robert Yates, together with a platoon of the 291st and a 57mm anti-tank gun crew from the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion, whose half-track had broken down passing through town, prepared to blow the bridges over the Amblev River as Paper's lead Panther tank came around the bend. The 57mm crew fired and immobilized the lead Panther before being killed by the tank's return fire. The engineers detonated their charges. The bridges collapsed into the river. Paper's primary route was blocked. Upstream, Lieutenant Albert Walter's platoon of the 291st rigged the Salm River trestle bridge for demolition. First Lieutenant Joseph Milgram of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, who had led the advance party into Trois-Ponts the night before, coordinated the effort. Sergeant Jean Miller's squad placed the charges and waited until German pioneers stepped onto the bridge before detonating them. The trestle dropped into the Salm as German armour closed in. That same afternoon, at approximately 16:45 hours, Lieutenant Alvin Edelstein's 2nd Platoon of Company A, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, destroyed the Neuf-Moulins Bridge over the Lienne Creek at Habillemont as Paper's tanks came within sight of the crossing. By Pergrin's account, it was Corporal Fred Chapin who fired the charges that dropped the bridge into the creek. Every bridge Piper needed was now at the bottom of a Belgian river, destroyed by engineers who were supposed to build bridges, not wreck them. According to the traditional account preserved in Janice Holt Giles' 1970 book, and in Pergrin's own memoir, Piper reportedly expressed his fury at those damned engineers in German. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the substance of his frustration is thoroughly documented. Paper's post-war statements and the 6th Panzer Army's war diary repeatedly cited American engineer demolitions as the direct cause of his failure to reach the Meuse. At Malmedy, the 291st's garrison of roughly 180 men, anchored by Company B under Captain John Conlin, established roadblocks at every approach road and organized a perimeter defense of the town against German probes by armor and infantry. Pergrin's command post was in the town itself. The 291st had no tanks, no tank destroyers, no artillery, and no infantry support of any kind during the first critical hours. They held Malmedy with nothing but rifles, machine guns, bazookas, and the roadblocks they built from whatever materials were at hand. It was not until approximately 0300 hours on December 18th that reinforcements from the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion and 3 platoons of A Company, 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion, arrived to strengthen the defence. Even then, the 291st remained a central component of the town's garrison, repulsing German probes throughout the following week. On the Orthe River line west of the main breakthrough, the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser, took up defensive positions that proved critical to the survival of the entire northern shoulder. Fraser's men established roadblocks at Hotten and along the key crossings, delaying the advance of the 116th Panzer Division and elements of the 58th Panzer Corps. Major Kane's monograph identified this delaying action as instrumental in providing the time needed for the 3rd Armoured Division and 84th Infantry Division to reach their defensive positions covering the approaches to the Praise. Meuse River. Without those hours bought by engineers at river crossings with rifles and demolitions, the German armour might well have reached the Meuse bridges before American reinforcements could arrive. The 202nd Engineer Combat Battalion fought at Stavelot. The 296th screened Youpon. The 158th held La Roche-en-Ardennes. The 35th and 44th screened the approaches west of Bastogne. Divisional engineer battalions of the 99th, 106th, 28th, 4th, 9th Armoured, and 7th Armoured Divisions fought from the very first hour of the German attack. Across the entire Ardennes front, from the Elsenborn Ridge in the north to Bastogne in the south, Engineer Combat Battalions constituted a critical and, in many places, irreplaceable element of the American defensive system during the first days before armored and infantry reserves could be brought forward. Three characteristics of this American engineer behavior consistently alarmed and baffled German tactical commanders. First, the speed and aggression with which demolitions were carried out under fire by junior leaders acting entirely on their own initiative, without orders from any higher authority. Second, the willingness of American engineers to remain in position and fight as infantry after blowing their demolitions, instead of withdrawing to the next line as German doctrine would have prescribed. Captured Germans from Piper's column expressed genuine astonishment that the troops who destroyed the bridges then stayed and fought rather than falling back. Third, the sheer density of American engineer units across the entire theatre. The Germans encountered engineers everywhere they attacked, creating a layered defensive depth far greater than the number of rifle battalions alone would have produced. The evidence from German records confirms the impact at every level of command. The war diary of 6th Panzer Army repeatedly attributed Piper's critical delays to American engineers who demolished bridges and held road junctions. Post-war interrogation reports of Piper and his subordinate officers singled out the loss of the Lien Creek Bridge and the Amblev bridges at Trois-Ponts as the decisive moments at which the campaign was effectively lost. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B headquarters issued operational orders making clear that panzer spearheads were to seize the Meuse and intermediate river crossings intact, before American engineer units could destroy them, a tacit acknowledgement that the speed and independence of American engineer demolitions posed a serious threat to the entire offensive plan. For its performance during the Bulge, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation, awarded by 1st United States Army Headquarters on February 18, 1945. The citation stated that the officers and men of the battalion stubbornly resisted all enemy attempts to penetrate their positions, and that repeated attacks by enemy armor and infantry were repulsed with heavy losses inflicted by their resolute and determined resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Croix de Guerre from both France and Belgium. He continued to serve after the war, ultimately reaching the rank of colonel, and was awarded the Silver de Fleury Medal, one of the highest honors bestowed by the Army Corps of Engineers. He passed away in 2012 at the age of 94. In March of 1945, the same engineers who had fought as infantry in the Ardennes returned to their primary construction mission under conditions that were themselves intense combat. When elements of the 9th Armoured Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, the last intact crossing over the Rhine, it fell to the engineers to keep it standing and build the replacement bridges that would carry the Allied armies into the heart of Germany. On March 9th, the 291st began construction of a 1,032-foot M2 steel treadway bridge approximately 400 meters downstream of the captured Ludendorff Bridge. They worked under continuous German artillery fire, mortar bombardment, and periodic air attacks at a construction site the soldiers grimly nicknamed Suicide Point. They completed the bridge in 32 hours, opening it to vehicle traffic at approximately 1700 hours on March 11th. It was the first tactical bridge built by the Western Allies across the Rhine River. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion built a 969-foot reinforced heavy pontoon bridge nearby, completing it in just 27 hours. The fastest construction of a major under-fire pontoon bridge by American engineers in the entire war. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17th, 28 American engineers were killed and 93 wounded. 6 men of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion died in the collapse, with 11 more listed as missing and presumed drowned. The 291st rushed to their Treadway Bridge downstream and pulled 18 survivors from the freezing waters of the Rhine. No other Western army used its engineers the way the Americans did. British Royal Engineers were well trained and frequently found themselves under fire, but they were less commonly committed as independent battalion-sized infantry formations, holding sectors of the line for days at a time. The 79th Armoured Division's specialised assault engineer units, the famous Hobart's Funnies, represented a different model entirely, one of highly specialised vehicles and crews designed for specific breaching tasks, rather than general infantry combat. Soviet sapper battalions and the assault engineer sapper brigades, formed in 1943, equipped with body armor and submachine guns, fought as shock infantry in urban combat operations like the battles for Stalingrad, Budapest, and Berlin. But the Soviet model emphasized short-duration, concentrated assault action, rather than the sustained defensive operations over days and weeks that characterized American engineer employment. German pioneers found themselves fighting as line infantry frequently in the final years of the war, but always out of desperation born of catastrophic losses in the grenadier ranks, never as a deliberate doctrinal choice made when alternatives were available. The roots of this American engineer fighting tradition reached back further than the Second World War itself. In the First World War, the 1st Engineer Regiment had fought as infantry during the Meuse-Argonne offensive and in the fighting near Verdun in 1918. A sergeant named Wilbur Collier of that regiment had earned the Medal of Honor for heroism in close combat against German troops, an action that had nothing to do with building or demolition and everything to do with bayonets and grenades. When the army rebuilt itself after Pearl Harbor, that lineage was deliberately invoked. General Leslie McNair, who oversaw the vast expansion of American ground combat forces, understood that the next war would require every branch to fight. He insisted that engineer battalions receive infantry training comparable to what rifle units received. The formal result was a force structure no other Western army possessed, a combat engineer branch that was genuinely prepared to wage war as infantry at a moment's notice. This training philosophy paid dividends not only in the dramatic set-piece battles, but in the hundreds of smaller engagements that never made the history books. Between D-Day and the end of the war, American engineer units fought in the hedgerows of Normandy during the grueling weeks after the landings, providing close demolition support during Operation Cobra's breakout in July of 1944. They fought alongside armoured spearheads during the race across France, clearing roadblocks and repairing bridges under sniper fire, as General Patton's Third Army swept eastward at a pace that left the logistics trains struggling to keep up. They fought at the Siegfried Line in the autumn, breaching Dragon's Teeth, anti-tank obstacles and blowing pillboxes along the West Wall fortifications. In each of these campaigns, the dividing line between their engineering mission and their combat mission blurred until it barely existed at all. The numbers behind the American engineer effort in Europe tell a story that goes far beyond individual heroism. Over the course of the war in the European theatre, American engineers built or repaired more than 40,000 miles of road. They constructed over 2,700 bridges, ranging from hasty timber trestle crossings thrown across streams in hours to massive steel and pontoon structures spanning rivers hundreds of feet wide under enemy fire. They cleared millions of individual mines. They operated quarries, sawmills, water purification plants, and map reproduction facilities that kept the entire Allied logistical system functioning. They constructed airfields, hospitals, ammunition dumps, and prisoner of war enclosures. And throughout all of that staggering volume of construction work, they maintained the training, the weapons proficiency, and the combat readiness to drop their tools and fight at any moment. No other engineer force in the war matched that combination of scale and dual capability. The individual soldier who made this system work carried a burden that would have been divided between two completely separate military occupations in any European army. He was expected to understand soil mechanics, bridge load calculations, demolition formulas, mine identification and neutralization, water purification chemistry, road surveying, and timber construction. At the same time, he had to maintain his skills with the M1 Garand rifle, know how to operate a .30 caliber machine gun, understand the fundamentals of infantry, fire and movement, construct fighting positions, execute combat patrols, and be prepared to engage enemy soldiers at close range. The engineering knowledge gave him the ability to reshape terrain. The infantry training gave him the ability to defend what he had built or destroy what the enemy needed. Both skills were tested repeatedly throughout the European campaign. The cost of carrying this dual mission was measured in blood. While the Army's Medical Statistical Service never compiled separate theatre-wide casualty figures for engineer combat battalions, the evidence from individual unit records is plain. In the Huertgen Forest, engineer battalions attached to infantry divisions suffered casualties at rates that paralleled those of the rifle regiments beside them. During the Battle of the Bulge, the 22 engineer battalions fighting as infantry took losses proportional to their exposure at the front. At Remagen, 28 engineers died, and 93 were wounded when the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed. and scores more were killed or wounded by the constant German artillery fire that hammered the replacement bridge construction sites along the Rhine. These men fought under the same conditions as the infantry, against the same enemy, but with lighter weapons, no organic mortar support, and no anti-tank guns beyond the bazooka. What they endured required not only physical courage but the particular discipline of men who knew they were not designed for this fight and chose to wage it anyway. What ultimately set the American combat engineer apart was not any single quality but the combination of several that no other army replicated in the same way. The United States possessed the industrial capacity to raise 700 engineer battalions and train every one of them in both construction and combat. It fostered a military culture that trusted junior leaders, lieutenants, sergeants, and even corporals to make consequential decisions on their own initiative without waiting for authorization from above. And its doctrinal framework, shaped by McNair's Army Ground Forces reforms, placed engineering at the center of combined arms operations rather than at the periphery. Engineers were positioned at the leading edge of every advance and at the rearguard of every withdrawal. When the front collapsed, they were already there. The contrast with German practice could not have been sharper. In the Wehrmacht of late 1944, an engineer officer who blew a bridge without Hitler's personal authorization risked execution. An American corporal who blew a bridge on his own judgment received a commendation. That single difference in command philosophy, repeated across hundreds of crossings, intersections, and defensive positions throughout the European theatre, produced an operational effect that no amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome. Piper's Kampfgruppe was not stopped by a grand defensive scheme devised at Supreme Headquarters. It was stopped by individual engineer squads, making individual decisions at individual bridges, each one acting faster than the German command structure could react. The German High Command understood the problem, but understanding it and solving it were two different things. The operational orders for the Ardennes offensive had emphasized the need to capture bridges intact, specifically because of the threat American engineers posed. But by the time the offensive stalled, the decisive bridges were already at the bottom of the Amblève, the Salm, and the Lienne, blown by men whose names do not appear in most histories of the war. Those names deserve to be remembered. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, the Penn State graduate who commanded the 291st through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine. Colonel H. Wallace Anderson, whose dispositions of the 1111 Engineer Combat Group placed the right battalions on the right roads at exactly the right moment. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser of the 51st, whose battalion blew bridges at Trois-Ponts and then built one of the fastest pontoon bridges of the war at Remagen 3 months later. Major Robert Yates, who directed the defense at Trois-Ponts when the crisis came. Captain Sam Scheuber, whose Company C of the 51st dropped the Amblève Bridge as Paper's tanks rounded the bend. Captain John Conlin, who held Malmedy with roughly 180 engineers. Lieutenant Alvin Edelstein, whose platoon blew the Lienne Creek Bridge with Paper's armor in plain sight. Sergeant Gene Miller, who waited until German soldiers stepped onto the Salm trestle before detonating the charges beneath their feet. These were not men who sought infantry combat. They were engineers who met it because it came to them, and who rose to it with a professionalism that left their enemies shaken. The 22 engineer combat battalions that fought as infantry during the Battle of the Bulge represented the peak of this American innovation, but the phenomenon extended across every campaign in the European theatre. From the obstacle-strewn killing ground of Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, through the dark ravines of the Huertgen Forest, across the frozen Ardennes in the war's cruelest winter, and finally over the Rhine itself under continuous shellfire, American combat engineers carried two identities into battle and proved equal to both. They built more than 40,000 miles of road, and they fought on the roads they built. They constructed 2,700 bridges, and they demolished the bridges the enemy needed. They cleared millions of mines from the path of advancing armies, and they laid minefields that stopped the most powerful armored formations in the German order of battle. No other combat branch in any army carried so broad a mandate or fulfilled it so completely. And no other engineers in the war made the enemy pay so high a price for the assumption that the men with the shovels would not also carry rifles. The Germans came to understand this only after it had already cost them the campaign. Every blown bridge, every defended crossroads, Every roadblock held by men who should have been building something rather than destroying something represented a failure of German intelligence to grasp the nature of the force opposing them. The American combat engineer was not a construction worker who happened to carry a weapon. He was a soldier who happened to know how to build. And when the moment came to choose between his two callings, he did not choose at all. He did both.